G'day and welcome back to The Shed. Today we're going to take a look at the 2008 novel by Liu Cixin, The Free Body Problem. It was later translated by Cixin Liu and won the Hugo Award in 2015. So what I would like to do, as always, is provide a spoiler-free plot overview, talk to what I liked, what I didn't like, I'll put it to the memory test, I'll make some recommendations, and then we'll rank it on our ever-growing sci-fi shed ladder, where I've been ranking all the Hugo and Nebula award-winning novels. So when it comes to the plot overview, please forgive me if I mispronounce some of these names, but we have a Yi Wenji, who's an astrophysicist who's just seen her father killed by the Red Guard during the Chinese Cultural Revolution. So this has landed her in jail as a traitor to her nation, and she's sent to prison. She's later released into the custody of a Yang Weining, who works for this Red Coast program, and they're using these big, large sort of radio waves, powerful radio waves, to disrupt spy satellites. But they've also got a secret alternate purpose, and that is the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. So the novel is written in this non-linear plot, and we switch forward to the present in this guy called Wang Miao. And he's a nanotech professor who's having some strange hallucinations. And he happens to be in touch with a detective, Shi Quang, who's investigating some mysterious murders that seems to be loosely, not quite connected, but appear to be killing all these science experts in the field. And they seem to be suiciding, doing all sorts of weird stuff. And the detective is investigating these cases. So he's asked Wang to keep his eyes open in this circle of scientists to see if there's anything odd going on. And what Wang realizes is that they seem to be playing this game called the Free Body. And what Wang learns is that the inhabitants of this game live in this planet surrounded by three suns, hence the name The Free Body Problem. And for those of you who are not familiar with orbital mechanics, I wasn't, I must admit, back in 2015 when I first read this novel. It deals with the principles that if you have three separate bodies in space having gravitational force against each other, it's impossible using today's math and understanding in physics to predict the orbit of these different bodies in the system. So that sort of become chaotic. It's really impossible to determine exactly where the paths will take, which leads to some rather interesting consequences for the game inhabitants. Because the only way we can predict it today is by literally brute forcing computers with a point in time and just brute forcing these numbers in to see exactly where that thing may end up being, right? But this has a rather interesting side effect for the life forms on this game planet, because they're going through different cycles of these chaotic eras and peaceful eras, where they're trying to understand and evolve as a species into technological ages. And they're trying to come up with ways to predict the movements of the stars that they see and the sun in the ecosystem. And they're failing, right? There's literally doesn't seem to be any real way to predict these movements. And it has some really interesting effects on the inhabitants of these planets, and they overcome these challenges. So that was really rather fascinating in the gameplay. So really the question then is put, will the Red Coast be successful in receiving messages from alien life forms? And if we do, how would we respond? What are the consequences of us sending these signals out into space, expecting to hear back from some of these alien species if they exist somewhere out there? And what should our response be, our calculated response? And will the fate of humanity rely on just a handful of people in this Red Coast Guard? So look, all rather wonderful sort of concepts explained away in this wonderful novel by Liu Cixin. So what is there to like in particular? Look, right at the beginning of this novel, I thought Liu Cixin did a wonderful job of portraying life in that cultural revolution, because it really sort of did set the scene for these characters and what drives them, what some of their motivators were, that I found rather enjoyable in the novel. The other thing I would say is I really enjoyed the concept of that free body problem. Now, when I first read this back in 2015, honestly, I wasn't aware of the problem in orbital mechanics when it comes to the free body problem. And it wasn't until after I'd read the book that I started researching, and I occasionally watch videos just to refresh my memory on the subject. But I've got to say that having that some of that knowledge now, albeit very minor knowledge, very basic knowledge of the subject, I found it rather interesting this time round, understanding the problem and how these inhabitants in this gameplay, these aliens, sort of dealt with that problem. And I found that to be a really enjoyable concept, one that is unique in the science fiction genre. The other thing that I enjoyed is there's a section in the novel that talks to computer architecture, and it does that in a rather novel way that I really enjoyed. And I won't speak to it to destroy your reading pleasure, but needless to say, I think if you're a computer architect, there's a section in this novel that talks to computer architecture with the service bus, with the different registers and how they operate, but it's put a rather interesting spin on it that I think you'd thoroughly enjoy that, which I definitely did as well. So how influential are the likes of Arthur C. Clarke that introduced the space elevator to us in science fiction? Because there's talk of the space elevator here in Wang being this nanotechnology professor. So I really did like the tribute to the space elevator program. But I also like the interesting take that he had using the same kind of technology that may be able to build something like the space elevator. But they used it again in a rather interesting and fresh way that I hadn't seen before, which I thought was really spot on as well. So look, a lot of praise for Liu Cixin's The Free Body Problem, a very thoroughly enjoyable book, but what is there that I didn't like in this one? Look, it's always hard when you really enjoy a book to talk to some of the negatives. So when it comes to the dislikes, I'd have to say this, that sometimes I felt the novel suffered from that narrative momentum, right? It's almost like he had these really wonderful ideas that he just wanted to get into his book, and it was almost like an afterthought to introduce the plot into this and how do we string all these together. Look, that may be a bit harsh because it definitely reads quite well. I don't want to take that away from it. But sometimes, I don't know, maybe it's a consequence of having some really big ideas and the plot trying to keep up with those ideas, if that makes sense. But I sort of did see that a little. That may be distracting to some readers. So when it comes to this series, I think this series, I've read them all. I think they're just wonderful novels. But I'd have to say that as a standalone novel, this one doesn't quite, it's not quite a perfect standalone novel. Sometimes it does feel like it's just an introduction to this world and some of the consequences and what we expect may happen with the subsequent novels, right? So it's almost like a prelude to these wonderful stories. But look, it does work as a standalone, but again, I'd have to just make an observation, perhaps more than anything else, to say that maybe just as a standalone novel, it's not quite got the strength that some of the others we've seen on the board have to date. So when it comes to recommendations, look, I can't recommend this one enough. It is a wonderful novel, very refreshing concepts and ideas that I think you thoroughly enjoy. Now, similar novels we've covered to date on the board, I would have to say, the father of the space elevator and Arthur C. Clarke. So if you haven't read this one and you like the concept of that nanotechnology being used to build something like a space elevator, then I'd say have a look at Arthur C. Clarke's The Fountains of Paradise. I think you will enjoy this, and vice versa. The other one that comes to mind is Kim Stanley Robinson's Red Mars. There's also an interesting concept around the space elevator here and how it's used to colonize a planet like Mars. So again, if you enjoyed The Free Body Problem and you like the idea of that space elevator and you wanted to see it explored a little bit more, I say have a go at Red Mars. Completely different type of novel, but I think one that you will enjoy as well. If you've read books like The Gods Themselves by Isaac Asimov, this is rather an interesting, fascinating novel as well that I'm actually just about finished, which will feature in next week's review. This talks to similar kind of concept, right, where we're trying to communicate with these alien species and what are the consequences of that. Rather fascinating novel, and I think if you've enjoyed The Gods Themselves, I say have a go at The Free Body Problem because I think you'll enjoy that one as well. And last but not least, I would say if you really want to get into the brain of these alien species and how would they be different to us, I say there's been no better demonstration of that in A Case of Conscience by James Blish. Really do enjoy the thought processes here that Blish put together when confronted with this alien species and how different are they to us and can we reconcile them in this particular case with a Catholic faith. So wonderful novels. Hey, when it comes to the memory test, I read this one back in 2015, and I've got to say it stood up to the memory test really well. And it's one of those novels that makes you want to learn, right? Like I mentioned about the free body problem. I remember after I read it, I started researching it a bit, trying to understand the mechanics behind this, and I find it to be a fascinating subject and one that actually added to my enjoyment of the novel this time round. So I'd say when it comes to concept, and it was definitely a memorable concept, but I got to say some of the characters were forgettable. I don't think it's really a character-driven novel. It's really an ideas-driven novel, and that did not let me down when it comes to the memory test. We've got to rank it on our growing sci-fi share ladder. Let me flip the cameras around and see where this one lands tonight. So back to the share ladder and ranking today's 2015 Hugo Award winning novel by the Chinese author Liu Zhezhen in The Free Body Problem. Now this is going to be a rather interesting novel when we apply our full criteria, which I've documented down below, and see exactly where this one lands. Because I think it's fair to say that this is an ideas or a concept driven novel more than it is a character driven novel. And I think when I look at my weighting criteria, it gets some really strong points for the concepts, but it loses a couple of points in the execution. Like I mentioned in my plot overview, sometimes I feel like it was more I want to get these ideas in and I'm going to make a way, as opposed to these ideas just flowed out of the plot, right? So it lost a couple of points in the execution, as it did a couple of points for the characters as well. When it comes to the writing, I didn't mention it in my dislike section because I did find some observations, let's say, when it comes to the writing, but I took that to translation errors or translation more than I did the original text. I've got a friend who's read this in the original text in Chinese. So if you're watching, Jan, I would love to have a chat with you, maybe on the show one day, to talk to your experiences reading the original text, or maybe if you're a viewer and you've read the original Chinese version of this novel, I'd like to hear your thoughts when it comes to the actual writing. But look, when it comes to my criteria, it lost a couple of percentage points when it came down to the writing. It did really well again, though, when it comes to the memory test. I think it almost just about got full marks, and lost just again a couple of percentage points when it comes to the ending. Now, many of you will be jumping saying, what do you mean the ending? That's probably one of the best endings ever. And look, it is a very enjoyable ending. I don't want to take away from that. But I'd have to say, as a standalone novel, sometimes I feel like those novels should be able to be read on its own and give you the full punch. Oh, wow, I got the story. I know exactly this is great ending, right? As opposed to leaving you wanting to read some of the sequels. It's a bit unfair, but sometimes I really feel like that a novel should stand alone as a complete piece of work, and any additional novels written in that series should just almost start afresh, right? It's a bit unfair, but that's just my personal feelings. So it's lost a couple of points when it comes to the ending, which sort of means it's not going to make the A side, right? It just didn't quite have what it takes to make what is an absolutely friggin' top 10 or 15 that we have here on the A side. So it's going to sit somewhere on the B side, which has got some wonderful novels. Like, we got The Heinleins on there, for goodness sakes. We have Ringworld from Larry Niven. We have Demolished Man, Besta. We have Roger Zelazny. We have Greg Bear's Moving Mars. We have Red Shirts, one of my favorites. We got, among others, The Uplift War. Wonderful novels. So this, as an introduction into Chinese science fiction on the Sci-Fi share ladder, is a wonderful place to be. And the question is it going to be better than Ringworld? Now, I'd say that Ringworld, where it sort of got a couple of more points, was the concept. I thought the concept was just unforgettable. At least the impact that it had the first time I read it was just an unforgettable novel. And this one was as well, but I honestly feel that if you weren't quite familiar with the free body problem in orbital mechanics, I don't think it would have had quite the same impact. I may be mistaken in that, but that was my experience the first time round. It didn't quite have the same impact as it had this time round, me understanding that concept a little bit better. So I'd have to say, as a standalone novel, I think Ringworld was just much better concept, just that was executed a lot better in my personal humble opinion. What about books like Red Mars? Now, we talked about Red Mars when it comes to recommendations, and it's kind of sits somewhere here, right? It's going to be just below or just above Red Mars. Now, Red Mars, and we got Lord of Light, Lodges and Lasny there as well. Now, Red Mars had an amazing terraforming concept, right? It had an amazing cast of characters that were unforgettable, and as much as the plot had some issues towards the end of the book, I think just the overall concept and execution of Red Mars was just a wonderful piece of work. And even though that was a trilogy as well, we got Blue Mars and Green Mars, or Green Mars and Blue Mars as well, that novel did, you could leave it at Red Mars and be completely satisfied, which was not the case we have with, Liu Zhejian's The Free Body Problem. So I'm going to give it a slight edge to Red Mars. Lord of Light was also another interesting one, because that also read like a bunch of short stories, had some really interesting concepts, but I'm going to have to say that I'm going to give it to Liu Zhejian's The Free Body Problem over Roger Zelazny's, based on the concepts and some of the ideas. It was a wonderful novel, right smack bang in the middle of the ladder, which I think is a really wonderful place to be when it comes to a really wonderful novel. Hey, have you read The Free Body Problem by Liu Zhejian? Have you read the series? Would you rank it higher or lower? I suspect there would be a lot of people that would rate this one right up there. And it is definitely a worthy novel. It's a wonderful novel. But that's where we stand tonight. As always, I'd love to hear your opinions. We got The Gods Themselves by the giant Isaac Asimov next week. So I hope you hit that like and subscribe and notification bell so you don't miss out. And I'll see you next time in the shed.